Thank you all for joining us this evening. Tim Spector is a professor of genetic epidemiology at King's College London and an honorary consultant physician at Guy's and St. Thomas's hospitals. He is a multi-award-winning expert on personalized medicine and the gut microbiome, and the author of 4 books, including the best-selling The Diet Myth and his latest, Spoon's Bed. Tim appears regularly on TV and radio around the world and contributes to The Guardian, among other publications. In this talk, he will reveal why almost everything we've been told about food is wrong. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Tim Spector.
Thanks very much. Thanks for joining us this evening. And I'm going to try and cover a number of different areas. Obviously, the book was written before COVID, and its delay was because of COVID. But for the last 6 months, I've been working in that area, like everybody, a new expert with no real expertise in it, having to learn something on the fly. But hopefully we'll discuss all these things and see how COVID, nutrition, gut microbes are all potentially linked. That's the plan anyway. We'll see how we go. Now, pre all this, for the last nearly 30 years, I've been working with twins, set up the UK Twin Registry, which has now 14,000 twins on it, looking at nature v nurture and how similar twins were and the powerful effects of genetics. But perhaps the last 10 years, I was more interested in the differences between twins, why one would be fat, one would be thin, one would be depressed, one would be happy, why one would develop cancer and the other wouldn't. And this is unusual for genetic clones. So something else had to be very different. And it turned out the thing about them that was most different was their gut microbes. And we'll discuss more into that. And that's why, in a way, by studying the differences between identical twins, I really got into nutrition and the gut microbes. And by doing that, I really uncovered all these myths about food and nutrition, which had really annoyed me because I'd been repeating these myths myself as a doctor to other people and patients, etc. So that really has been my mission of the last 10 years, is to correct some of these errors and put everything really in a new context of gut microbes. Now, nutrition advice has been given to us since the Second World War, when we were told how to avoid deprivation and vitamin deficiency, and governments increasingly tried to control us in terms of what was the perfect thing to eat. And whether it was in the US or the UK, everything looked pretty much the same. There was a one-size-fits-all approach to this. There was, 2,000 calories for women, 2,500 calories for men, this amount of fat, this amount of protein, etc. And it turns out, there isn't quite as much consensus as you might have thought. And to test this with the company Zoe that I've been working with on personalized medicine and personalized nutrition, we managed to persuade 13 professors of nutrition in the UK and the US to do a blind study where they would rank 100 common foods in terms of how good or bad they were for our health. You think this would be fairly easy to do. These are world experts, and these are 100 common foods. They're not talking about rare ones they'd never seen. And so you would have expected a graph that looked like, if you had 3 professors, they would broadly agree that things were bad in the red and that other foods were good in the green. And when we actually got the results, we got something completely different. The reality was that they did agree at their far ends. There were quite a few foods that they everyone's thought were bad, such as bowls of sugar or rice, biscuits, and bits of fried chicken. And at the other end, extra virgin olive oil, berries like blueberries, etc. And in the middle, no agreement. So real problems here with things like artificial sweetened drinks and foods. Orange juice, interestingly, came out, was no real consensus about good or bad. Cheese, and then you had this whole area of low-fat dairy and full-fat dairy, and then a few weird items like dried fruits and sultanas that have high sugar contents. So things weren't as clear as you might have imagined. And meat was also another area of big contention, whether it was good or bad for us. And the reason is that we as individuals are complicated, and food itself is complicated. And I think that's what we're going to get into here. And one reason we're complicated is that we have these 100 trillion microbes inside us that alter the way we process food in very unique ways. And we're only been working on these properly for the last 10 years, and we're still uncovering the enormous function. But the best way to think of them is as like a virtual organ in your body, so that it's like discovering you've got a new liver, for example. And every week goes by, we find another function. And it turns out that these have good and bad effects of our gut microbes. They break down fiber, and they produce something called short chain fatty acids, which are super good for most of the processes in our body, giving off antioxidants, etc. They improve the way you can break down fats. They reduce inflammation. They're good for your metabolism and sugar control, and they will reduce the risk of infections and really hone up your immunity to nasty things like coronavirus. When it goes wrong, they can cause all kinds of problems, from diarrhea to increased heart disease. And we know that there are effects of drugs also affect the gut microbiome. Common ones like PPIs, proton pump inhibitors for your gut, antibiotics, but virtually every drug you take, including antidepressants, will be broken down by your microbes, which explain why they work differently in different people. And you can modulate your microbes through diet, and that's a good thing. Now, just to mention, an increasing area of work is how the microbes affect your brain. And they do this because they produce neurochemicals themselves that we can't produce, things like tryptophan and serotonin, which are key to anxiety and depression and are at the core of how antidepressants work. And they get there via the vagus nerve or in the bloodstream. And studies recently are showing that changing people from bad junk food diets to Mediterranean diets will have as much beneficial effect on the brain and your mood as standard antidepressants without many of the side effects. So this is a real good example of food as real medicine. But before we go deeper, just you probably know all this, but you could assess the microbiome now with genetic sequencing techniques that are getting cheaper every year and more detailed every year. So you can get a full idea of thousands of different species for about £100 test now, that is unimaginable just a few years ago. So that tells you every gene and every microbe in your gut. Now, this is very complicated data, so to simplify it, a simple concept that we've generally used for health, which works in most situations, is to say when the diversity, the number of species is low, you're more likely to be ill and have problems. And if it's high, and you have lots of different species, you are at low risk. And it's a bit like having a garden that looks like an Arizona backyard with very few species and all kinds of weeds can grow, versus an English country garden where everything's flourishing. And you can see this whole list of conditions and diseases on the left, ranging from obesity to autism, and low diversity is implicated in all of them. Now, that's a very crude approach, but it's actually a better way of telling someone's health than actually studying their DNA. Now, the good news is that the people who have the highest microbiome diversity, and that means that because microbes are basically chemical factories, you've got more chemical factories than anyone else, you can produce a much wider range of healthy chemicals. Those people we found in our big study in America and the UK have on average 30 plants per week. And that doesn't mean 30 types of kale, it's 30 different plants you need to be eating. So it's the diversity rather than anything else that's important. And we also, other elements of food other than just plants and fiber and their contents, which are polyphenols, but you've got all these other chemicals in food, particularly in ultra-processed foods, which are very bad for your gut microbes. And this is one reason that I'm against them, is because these are supposed to be neutral, have no effect on us, but no one studies them properly on the gut microbes. And when you do, you get surprising results. And this is my reading of myself taking sucralose, an artificial sweetener. I actually got a blip in my sugar count. So something in my brain was telling me this was sweet. And it's probably a reason why when you switch from sugary drinks to diet drinks, you don't lose weight or get less diabetes. Now, I think we now have the technology with these glucose monitors and our knowledge of food and high computing to start being able to predict individual responses to food. And I certainly learned some amazing lessons when I first started to use one of these monitors. I found that, for me, orange juice, which I thought was a health drink, was really quite deadly, as were my favorite fruit, grapes, and bread was another one that I found real problems eating. But everyone is different, as we'll explain. So I think we're now appreciating that the food we eat is the most important medicine we take. And there's many examples of that, as we've just explained, in depression. And the NHS has recently started to pay for people to go on, for the first time, liquid diets for diabetes, which are actually more effective than any medicine. But the question is, all these are good in theory, but which one is the one for you? We're not going to react the same. And just to emphasize this individuality, I want you to look at this chart from the Diet Fit study, which was a very large study of 809 Californians who were mildly obese, put on a low-fat diet or a low-carb diet for a year, and everyone expected their own views on which one was going to win. These are both healthy diets. They had plenty of fiber, and it was non-processed foods. But it turned out that they were equal. Both groups, on average, lost 5 kilograms. But the key here is that nobody is average. And when you look at each of these individual lines, you see that some people on each of the diets lost amazing amounts of weight, 25 kilos, and others actually gained weight on these diets. And we think they were doing them properly. And it's probably just because it didn't suit them. So this is the context of why we launched the PREDICT study, which is the world's largest food intervention study 3 years ago with colleagues in the company Zoe, and with the help of a group in Harvard and Stanford in the US. And the basis of this was to try and do enough studies in humans to look at personalized responses that you could add them together and give people personalized score for any meal. So you wouldn't just have a guess about whether you should be having low fat or low carb or count calories. An app will just tell you based on much more comprehensive data. And we started this study, and it was a massive undertaking. And if it wasn't working with a company, we'd still probably be writing the grants now. And this was published in June of this year in Nature Medicine, if anyone's interested. But basically, we took 1,000 people, including mainly lots of twins and 100 Americans, put them into a hospital setting for a day, gave them identical foods, and then measured everything we could for the next 8 hours. And this approach gave us some amazing results. And then we asked them to go home for 2 weeks with a glucose monitor measuring every 5 minutes what their blood glucose was doing, plus blood tests for fat levels, digital devices for sleep, and dietary logging every single meal, as well as taking poo samples for their microbiome. And nothing had ever been done on this scale before. Now, the interesting finding for me, the aha moment, was when we just looked at the blood results after eating identical muffins, and there was an 8 to 10-fold difference between normal people in how they react. So that means that you are going to react very differently to, the person next door, given an identical bit of food, which means that these blue and red lines mean nothing in terms of averages. And so this is true for fat, for sugar, for insulin, and also for inflammation, how much you respond to that meal in a negative, stressful way. And we think the more of these peaks happen after food, if they happen regularly, you will start gaining weight, have metabolic problems, and have problems with your general fatigue and energy levels. And it turned out that even identical twins turned out to be different. So these are genetic clones. Every cell in their body has the same identical DNA, but when it comes to food, it just shows how different we all are. And it turned out that genetics were not a big factor in how we respond to food, which goes against my training as a geneticist. And it also goes against many internet companies that are trying to sell you kits based on your DNA about giving you the ideal dietary advice. But what, of course, was different between them was their gut microbiome. And even identical twins only share 30% of their gut microbes. So everyone's unique in their food response, and genetics is a small component. And the other thing that was interesting was that the meal composition, the bits on the label of your food, only explained less than 30% of those responses. So as well as the gut microbiome, how you ate and when you eat, the timings, what you had the day before, how much sleep you had, how much exercise, also have a big effect. And so your circadian rhythms, whether you're a morning person, evening person, has a big effect on this. And so the only way to deal with this complexity is to put it into a big data scenario where you can suddenly put these things together in an app and get personalized nutrition. Now, and the reason that food labels are rubbish, and even if you can understand them, and probably only about 50% of people in the UK can, is because food is so complicated. And we've spent ages dumbing it down to the smallest common denominator. And that's why we're still obsessed with calories. The idea that that's the main thing you look at on a packet is really rubbish, because it's not about the fat and the calories. It's dumbing food down that has thousands of different ingredients and chemicals into 3 or 4 ingredients. And this omits all these interactions. It forgets about the food matrix, the fact that if you eat a whole nut rather than ground nuts, you're going to have very different responses. And of course, the whole effect of processing. Eating processed food is given the same score in this as real food, and it's totally processed differently by our body. And this is only serving the food companies that every year are giving us more and more ultra-processed food, and we eat more ultra-processed food than any other country in Europe. And this is something that is never really discussed openly in any policy, and it's probably the main reason we're also the fattest country in Europe. I'm going to switch topics now to just go on to what happened in March. Because we were using this app with this company Zoe, and we've been doing these studies on twins. We actually had the apparatus to do something. So I was very depressed. I was cycling home on about the 20th of March, having been told they were shutting down the hospital, my research center. The twins were sent home. We wouldn't be able to see them for 6 months. And so I said, well, we ought to be able to do something with this app and our expertise. So I spoke to the guys at Zoe, and they came up with converting the nutrition app to a symptom app. And we did this in 4 days. And within 24 hours, we had 1 million people downloading it. It's become the biggest citizen science project in health ever, as far as I'm aware. And this allows us to do all kinds of things about predicting symptoms of cluster symptoms, seeing what's going on around the country, performing real-time research, and allowed us to do the largest diet study in history. Over 1 million people doing a diet question online that would take you years and cost millions normally. And we did this as a not-for-profit collaboration between Zoe and my university at King's. I'm just going to give you a little taste of this. I hope most of you are already logging on and spreading the word about the app. But it gives us real-time data about what's happening across the country based on swab testing in a sample, and also predicted COVID based on your symptoms. And we were the first to point out that COVID was not just a reductionist simple flu based of fever and cough. There were at least 20 symptoms, but the most important one was loss of smell. And we showed this after about a month of logging. Everyone was coming back saying they were losing their smell. And it turned out these people had 10 times the risk of having a positive swab test compared to people with a cough or fever. And I think this is one of the big impacts we had. We're also looking at these other areas. And what is interesting, and the link in a way back with our nutrition, is that the 3 big risk factors for this were obesity, social deprivation, and diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And it turns out that the common link there is probably poor gut health and poor diet. And I'm going to show you some other data that backs this up, because we did a brief survey. This is the brief one. We've got a larger one coming out in a couple of weeks, but this is the brief survey to say, what happened to you during the 3 months of lockdown? What happened to your weight? What happened to your habits, etc. And briefly, across the whole country, each person put on nearly 1 kilogram. And of course, 20% of people actually lost weight. They're the sporty ones you saw jogging around the park and taking on new commitments and giving up alcohol. Whereas 30% of people actually gained weight, and most of those, it turned out, were in deprived areas, and when they did gain weight, and they were talking about 6 pounds in weight on average, it was because they were snacking more, and they were, by their own definition, eating less healthily. So they were buying junk foods, eating them more regularly, understandable as they were locked in, probably very stressed out with screaming kids, etc. The only thing that was worse in the affluent areas was drinking alcohol. And we also saw a direct correlation with geography. So this map looks exactly like the prevalence map at the moment of COVID across the country. Seems to match unhealthy behaviors during lockdown and possibly diets. But it is association, not causation. But I thought that was an interesting insight into what happened to all of us. And maybe it's our existing predispositions just got exaggerated. So there are big similarities between COVID-19 and nutrition. We're all making now hundreds of lifestyle choices about wearing masks, washing our hands. Do we shake someone's hand? Is it safe to go to this restaurant? Should I be shielding? Do I take vitamin D, etc., etc. In the same way we make choices about food. Everyone responds differently. COVID is a kind of weird disease that no one has ever seen before in terms of the range of different responses. And we're seeing, like we do with food, this huge range from nothing to severely ill or death. One size fits all advice just doesn't work. Government told us this was just flu, just 2 symptoms, and our data prove that's wrong. Genes don't play much of a role in both of these areas. Gut microbes probably play an important role in both, and the risk factors are very similar. And I think using artificial intelligence methods are going to be very successful in this, and which means that personalized prediction with an app is going to be possible, and it is always it's working with COVID. 4 million people have been logging, and 1.5 million have been doing this for 6 months, amazingly. And we're interacting with them every day, trying to get that content good. And we think the same is going to happen with a food app. And the company Zoe has launched its product in the US 4 weeks ago in sort of small numbers, but all the signs are that that's going to be a success and come to the UK early next year. Now, I want now to just touch on for the last 10 minutes a few of the myths that I cover in the book. And everyone's got their favorite myth and their least favorite myth, and I'm sure all of you will recognize these, and you'll have some that you say, oh, I never believed that one, or that's my favorite dogma. He's not going to shift me on that one. So we'll see. But basically, I didn't have a particular axe to grind, and I looked at all of these afresh, looked at the evidence, and have given my opinion on them. And you can decide when you read the book whether you believe me or not. The first one we've sort of discussed already. I think we've got rid of the one-size-fits-all guidelines, and hopefully you can disregard those, apart from the little bits that say we should be eating more fruit and veg, which I do agree with. Another controversial one is breakfast is the most important meal of the day. When I had my 1 minute on breakfast TV, I mentioned this. I didn't have time to elaborate, and had a Twitter storm attacking me for destroying the British breakfast and this nearly religious belief that you have to have a full breakfast in the morning for you and your children, otherwise your brain goes to mush and you get hypoglycemic and fall over. And it's simply not true. Some people like breakfast in the morning. I actually like breakfast. I'm a big breakfast fan, but most people don't wake up starving at 8 in the morning. or 7 in the morning, they could probably do without it. It's habit. And it's a recent phenomenon. When I was in Tanzania with the hunter-gatherer tribes, they didn't have a word for breakfast. And they never ate anything, as far as I could see, before about 10:30. So probably our ancestors didn't. And this is something that's been pushed on us by Kellogg's and food companies, and makes enormous amounts of money for them. Markups are huge. And so we've got a series of myths around that, about how it's good for children's brains and how it's really good for our metabolism. And it turns out that some people are morning people, some people are evening people, and that's something we're exploring in our studies. So I would just say to you, experiment, try going without breakfast, see how you feel. And some people overcompensate at lunch, others won't. But don't just listen to dogma. Your body will often tell you how it's feeling, if you like. Calorie counting doesn't add up. I've already been rude about calories, but the other thing is that you can't measure them precisely. And even if 2,000 calories was perfect for you, your chance of measuring it is virtually zero. Most of the errors on labels are plus or minus 20%. You go to restaurants, as proposed by Boris, having signs on fast food places, it goes up to about 30–40% error. And even nutritionists can't measure it all precisely by weighing it. And then the other side, you can't tell how much you're burning either. And so because the calories in, calories out equation is flawed, because when you exercise, you actually reduce or you don't eat food, your body compensates, and that's the problem. So no calorie controlled diet has been shown really to work well long term. My biggest problem is that it hides the quality of the food. That it's just that big label everyone looks at, and they forget to look at all the other ingredients. Fat, I haven't really got time to go into it, but there's no evidence, for example, that butter is any worse for you than margarine, despite the fact that most food companies make much more money on margarine than they do on butter. And that I think this 30-year fight against fat, the corner has been turned. There are enough experts now saying this is rubbish, there's much more important things to focus on, and that everyone will vary a bit, but it's not the main thing we should be looking at in our food. There are plenty of healthy fats, just as there are plenty of healthy carbs, and there isn't one size fits all. Supplements really don't work, is my conclusion for 99% of them. You'll have to read which is the one or two that might work. And vitamin D has been my bugbear, in that I was a real pro vitamin D fan for about 15 years and wrote many papers on it. I switched when it was found out it doesn't work for osteoporosis, doesn't prevent fractures. And we're just analyzing our data now to see if it has an effect on COVID. We have 1 million people who responded, and we should be able to give those results in a couple of weeks. I can't give you the answer, unfortunately, this evening. But suffice it to say that most association studies showing an association between a vitamin or a vitamin level and a disease have failed when you do a controlled trial test. And there also might be big differences between real food that contains vitamins that might be good for you and the extract, which is made in some Chinese factory and sold to us as the same thing, or even better, because it's even more powerful. So huge myths there. And the vitamin industry is don't underestimate, it's a huge multinational industry now worth hundreds of billions, and most vitamins in the world are controlled by about 10 companies. we've discussed sugar-free foods and drinks, again, for those effects. And I think there are some myths about processed foods. They're not all bad, so I'm certainly not knocking all processed foods. A lot of processed food, like cheese, is actually one of my favorite things to eat. The point I was trying to make is just because it's in a can or it's frozen doesn't mean it's bad. There's many good things like beans, canned tomatoes that have plenty of good nutrients in them and are extremely good value, and we should be using. Meat, a little bit of meat of high quality is probably good for us, and I don't believe that evidence. And the other one that people, and it was drummed into me, was that fish was always a good, healthy option. And I was taught that fish makes you brainy, it was good for your heart, and I thought the evidence was overwhelming until I actually got there and studied it myself. And it turns out that that is not the case. It's a marginal benefit when you look at the observational studies, and I think it's been over-egged for reasons that aren't entirely clear about the benefits of fish, probably because people believed that omega-3 fish oils were so effective as vitamins. And it turns out all those studies show them not to work when in randomized trials. So most of the fish we eat is now farmed, and that is very bad for the environment. And so if all of us ate 2 to 3 portions of fish a week, we'd have no fish in the oceans very soon. So I think we need to rethink our concept of fish, have it as a rare treat, go for quality rather than rubbish farmed salmon. I found myself coming up against vegans. You can tell I upset everybody in my book and my talk, so hopefully I'm doing that equally. Vegans often think they are on the healthiest diet. Our data suggests that it's not what you cut out of your food that's important, it's what you add to your plate. And so you can still be as healthy as vegans by having a small amount of meat, as long as you have enough plants on your plate. And I think that's really important. I myself had high blood pressure 10 years ago. I was told to reduce my salt intake, and I thought that was very sensible advice. My recent reading of it is that depriving you of yourself of salt is extremely unpleasant, makes all your food taste disgusting, and means you can never go out to a restaurant if you follow those guidelines. And the data for an individual benefiting like me is I get a 1% improvement in my blood pressure. So I've gone back to eating salt. I drink plenty of coffee because it's good for you. Well, I talk a bit about the exaggeration of the current trends of food allergies and gluten intolerance, which I think are a very dangerous trend. They're being fueled by the food companies selling us free from products and actually fueling this insecurity we have. Although there's no doubt we are more allergic than we were 30 years ago, probably because of our gut health. And I'll just skip through a few of these. We've talked about the importance of food for mental health, depression, anxiety. I think this is a really important thing, particularly in kids. Junk food looks like being really bad for our mental state. And I think we have to need much more research on that, about how food can help our mentality. Food companies have provided this myth that drinking 8 glasses of water, or preferably expensive mineral water, is absolutely crucial. Really bad for the environment, and no evidence at all that that's true. And there's a fair bit about pesticides and herbicides that we can talk about that have been around for a long time, and there's some evidence they cause cancer. Clearly it's not a huge problem, but do you really want to have a chemical on every bit of food you eat for the rest of your life without knowing a bit more about it. And finally, don't trust me, I'm a doctor. I'm a doctor, so you mustn't, just because I say I'm a doctor, believe anything I say, particularly when it comes to nutrition, because we are taught absolutely nothing. And I had about 2 hours of lectures when I was a medical student, and it's little better today. Sadly, most medical students know a lot more about scurvy than they do about treating obesity or diabetes with diet. So on that optimistic, upbeat note, I think I'll stop and take some of your questions, and just remind you that one size doesn't fit all. We're all unique. Most of the food facts we were told are false. Food and nutrition are complex. We all need to be citizen scientists of our own bodies, so experiment yourself, and please don't rely on food labels. Get yourself educated, and realize that I think educating yourselves and your family about food is the most important thing you could do, and we should be teaching this in schools from the grassroots up, and this should be a movement that we all take very seriously if we're going to survive the next few generations. Okay, so let's all be food experts. I look forward to some expert questions from you guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. We do have quite a few questions pouring in, but I will remind everyone that you can submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so the first question comes from Teresa. How does the breakfast myth apply to school children? Should they eat breakfast even if they're not hungry, especially if the next opportunity is a fixed lunchtime?
Great question. Well, I looked at the data on children, and there are less studies. So in adults, it's clear there's no evidence that skipping breakfast is bad for you. In children, we were told that it was bad for their behavior and that it would cause some intellectual problems. But the data really is very poor, and so it doesn't tell us either way whether it's good or bad, because the quality of the studies are so poor. So if I would suggest that if your child really doesn't want breakfast, then have a trial of not force them. We have a very good inbuilt system as humans for knowing when we want food, and it's called a hunger. And it's very rare for children to not feel that, and they will generally eat later in the day. And many children are like this. So I would suggest having that experiment, monitor their progress, speak to their teachers if you need to, but don't take it as dogma that they need to eat, otherwise they won't behave or they won't concentrate. Children now eat much more in school than they used to. When I went to school, there were no snack breaks. You just waited till your lunch, and then when you got home in the evening. Now it seems to be parents are made to feel guilty if they don't have sugary calories every 2 hours, and it's highly likely that could be counterproductive for them. So that's my general advice, but as always, it's very general, and everyone is going to be unique. But do some experimenting, just keep an eye on it, is my opinion.
Thank you. Rachel asks, how do we find out what is right for us individually, and sort of expanding on what you mean by experimenting?
Very good question. So obviously, until these personalized nutrition apps come to this country, we're going to have to go with our own instinct. Hopefully within a year or so, we'll be able to buy these glucose monitors ourselves. And that's what I did for the last year. I've been sticking these things on me, so I know what suits me. But about 1 in 4 people do feel sugar dips, for example. And so they know if they have too much carbohydrate, they can feel their sugar going down, they lose energy. And we showed that in one of our studies. So if you're someone who's quite tuned up, you can actually notice the difference between having a fatty breakfast, for example, or a carb breakfast, and you'll be able to see within a couple of hours what your energy levels are and how much hungrier you are at the next meal. So everyone can start to do that. And there might be, you do that at lunch or you do that at breakfast. Start switching things around, either by skipping meals or by swapping your carbs for fats, cutting out snacking or moving your meal times compressing them. That's all I can suggest at the moment. And some people will be more tuned to this than others. And you'd have to go on a long time before you notice changes in your weight, for example. So I think it's just go on how you feel, see if you can find something that really suits your body.
Thank you. Ellie asks, what are the myths around allergies and food intolerances?
Well, that's a whole hour's talk just on that question. I think allergies, people think that that they can be allergic to many things, when it turns out they're often, when you test them, they're not, they're just sensitive to some things, and they often go to seek private testing with their nail clippings or hair or blood spot testing, and get a whole list of food allergies from these other health professionals who aren't allergy experts. And we often, that's massively overdiagnosed. So that's the first thing. The second thing is things like gluten allergy or gluten intolerance is overdiagnosed about 10 times. So there's about 1% of people are truly have celiac disease and they know about it. They'll just have like projectile vomiting and weight loss when they have gluten. Other people say, oh, I feel a bit bloated, or I put on weight when I have something with gluten in it, therefore I'm gluten intolerant. And when these people are challenged, say there's 10 people who say that, 1 or 2 of those will have some gluten problem. The other 8, it's largely a placebo effect. And so that's the big one. It's really an overestimate of this, but that's in the context that food allergy is growing in children. Asthma is decreasing and is being replaced by food allergy. And I think it's probably because we're not exposing our children enough to lots of different foods early on. Things like nut allergy virtually doesn't exist in countries where the very young children get to eat peanuts. And I think this is all part of this whole idea. The more you can expose your children to different foods rather than protecting them from them, the less it will be.
Thank you. An anonymous attendee asks, what are your thoughts on kombucha? Amazing for the gut, myth or truth?
I drink kombucha, so I'm biased, and I make my own, and it's quite fun. And actually, it's a good thing for people who haven't tried it. Who don't know, it's fermented tea. It's very easy. You just get a mother, a bit like you would do for sourdough, stick it in a bit of tea leaves and sugar, and it will grow in after 10 days into a lightly fermented, mildly alcoholic beverage. Studies show it does contain huge amounts of microbes, so perhaps 20 times more than in yogurt. So it's highly likely to be good for you, although the studies are rather limited in clinical work. Seems to work in animals, so I think it probably does work. And in general, I'm a big believer in having some fermented food every day for your gut. You don't have a lot. You need a small amount regularly, and it can be any of the 3 Ks, kefir, kombucha, or kimchi is my other favorite. Anyone who knows South Korean kimchi. they're all got the highest concentrations of microbes. You don't need very much, just need them regularly.
Tatiana asks about fasting. Both intermittent and several day water fast have become very popular recently. How does fasting affect the microbiome?
The microbiome loves fasting. And there was a recent study, clinical trial, showing that all the microbiome species that were good tend to increase in people who are intermittent fasting and resting their gut. So there's two current ideas. One is the intermittent fasting, which has been around for about 8 years now. And then more recently, this restricted time feeding, where you try and eat your meals in like an 8-hour window and have, at least 12, 14 hours overnight where you're not eating anything. And both of these approaches seem to help gut microbes. Intermittent fasting seems to be an easier way to lose weight long term. It probably doesn't make a huge difference in the amount of weight you lose, but it's easy to sustain because you can actually keep a normal diet going. You don't have to be drinking Slim Fast or just having cabbage soup every day of your life. So it's more realistic as a way of doing things. So I think the whole concept of fasting has been around with human religions for thousands of years, and it does serve a good purpose. So all the studies show that it does improve the diversity of your gut and allows it to heal up overnight. Whereas if you're snacking all the time, or you go down to the fridge when you can't sleep, that's bad news for your gut.
Donna asks about fermented foods. Would you recommend them, and how can you tell which ones are beneficial?
So in general, I recommend fermented foods, and that can be anything from sourdough, which doesn't contain live microbes but is made through fermentation, which means it's sort of some people find it easier to digest, and even some celiacs have been found to not have that bad a reaction to it. To standard yogurt, cheese, and then the 3 Ks that I mentioned. And then you've got increasing numbers of these more industrial types, where they say they've added some fermented food to it. It looks a bit commercial. You need to see from the packet how many billion microbes are actually in there, what it's called CFUs, colony forming units. So you want to be looking for billions rather than millions, because a lot of them will die before they get to you. But in general, the less processed, the better. The more you know where it comes from, the better. And even better if you can make it yourself, then there's no doubt, you just smell it, you know it's got bags of microbes in there. So at the moment, there's no real test of authenticity. And so it's a bit of a trial and error. But some of the kefirs, for example, do put on their label exactly which bugs are in them. And you want to look for the ones that have the most varied microbes in them.
Thank you. Lloyd asks, and there's actually quite a few questions about water. So if it's nonsense that 8 glasses of water a day are important, should I drink water only when I'm thirsty? And others have asked about water filtration and fluoride.
So I could find no evidence of this magical 8 glasses a day. And I think it was some very weak study that was propagated by the drinks companies. And remember, most of the bottled water we drink comes from 3 companies, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and Nestle, I think are have about 80% of the market. And they're the ones who've done best out of this idea, and also slightly rubbishing tap water. Although in most taste tests, blind taste test, tap water does pretty well. The only reason to drink more is if you're doing extreme exercise for a long time. And most studies show that if you're doing under an hour of exercise, you don't need any extra water. And there are now regularly 2 or 3 people a year dying in marathons from overhydrating. And nobody's dying from dehydration. So we've got it completely wrong. The human body has evolved to do long walks, long runs without water for long periods of time. We have all the mechanisms we need to sort ourselves out. So the idea we need either sports drinks or electrolytes to rebuild and repair is all nonsense unless you're a professional athlete. So for most of us, this is just consumer nonsense. And the other question was about filtering. Evidence on fluoride, I think in general it's very good for your teeth. And I don't think many people are very worried about fluoride for anything else as long as the levels are reasonable. So that seems to be okay. The other reason some people want to filter is for chlorine, which some people with tropical fish have noticed that it can kill them. But all you have to do is wait about 10 seconds after pouring a glass and the chlorine will have evaporated. So I think the main reason to use a filter is because it tastes better, or you get rid of some of the hardness in your area. So again, trial and error rather than a definite recommendation, because tap waters generally in this country are really pretty good and got plenty of nutrients in them. And there's no real difference between tap water and purified water in terms of things like chemicals and micro amounts of other pesticides and things in both of them.
Jan asks, are you gaining traction in Westminster, and are they listening? How long do you think your findings will take to filter down into advice for the general population?
Are we talking about food or COVID? Because I'm having trouble with both. But okay, well, I guess food. I guess we're talking about nutrition. We're still battling on COVID to try and get these extra symptoms recognized, but at least I am talking to the government every day and getting heard. On the nutrition side, I'm not really getting heard as much, because I think the most obvious thing would have been done would be to expand the sugar levy, the sugar tax, to all junk foods. So you could then subsidize fruit and vegetables and put those in compulsory in schools. And the food industry has such a strong lobby, they stopped that happening. So the present government, I'm not very hopeful that they will do anything radical because of the power of commerce. So I think rather than relying on Westminster, I think we need to start a ground up movement of people insisting, starting in schools, that every child should, learn about food the same way they learn about reading and writing and maths. And that's how we can make a real change. And I think it's the children teaching, and getting schools involved. Education, I think, is the key to changing this, unless we have a radical government that it doesn't listen to big food.
Well, thank you. And it looks like it's about time to wrap up. I do want to say thank you to everyone at home for all of your questions. There are over 60 of them, so I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But thank you for joining us. Tim, again, thank you so much for such an interesting and engaging talk that has so many questions after it. I'm sure many of them can be answered in his book, Spoon-Fed, which is available. And with that, again, Tim, thank you. And thank you from everyone at home.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions. Nice chatting to you. Bye.
Bye now.